Hello and welcome to the Majlis podcast, Radio for Europe, Radio Liberty's current affairs talk show focusing on Central Asia. I'm Bruce Pannier, host of the Majlis and author of the weekly Central Asia in Focus newsletter. Tajik authorities' record on respecting human rights and media freedom and the rights of human rights defenders has been grim for some time. But after the government sent in security forces in May 2022 to stop peaceful protests in Tajikistan's eastern Gorno-Badakhshan Autonomous Oblast, and violence broke out, the campaign against journalists, activists, and rights defenders intensified. On July 4th, the UN issued a press release urging Tajik authorities to, quote, show a genuine commitment to improving the situation of human rights defenders in the country and expressed concern about convictions, unquote. To discuss all this, I am joined by Mary Lawlor, UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders and one of the experts who took part in preparing the UN press release. Ms. Lawlor visited Tajikistan late last year to visit the situation for herself, and thank you very much for joining me. First, could you describe for our audience what has been happening in Tajikistan recently that especially caught your attention?
Well, as you know, my mandate is Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights defenders. I'm mandated by the UN to investigate and make recommendations on the protection of human rights defenders. I carried out a country visit last year and was really appalled to look at the horrible injustice being done to human rights defenders who are peacefully carrying out their legitimate work on behalf of others in line with the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders. So we had a number of cases that we wanted to follow up on after the visit. So some of them we had difficulty in getting consent for because people are terrified and are afraid of backlash. But we did write to just lately to the Tajik government on 9 human rights defenders who have been imprisoned in Tajikistan for quite long sentences. In fact, some of them are very lengthy.
Thank you. And if we could just talk a little bit about, to get the time frame on this. This all started, I mentioned that there was violence in Gorno-Badakhshan in May 2022. But so really the time frame I'm looking at is like the last 14 or 15 months. Would you say there's an unusual amount of activity in detaining people and imprisoning people in that 14-month period?
Yeah. Well, in the communication that we sent, we did a timeline for each of the defenders that we took up. So as you said, it all started in May. And then you had the situation where defenders were lifted. And, right from the get-go, the trial process was deeply flawed. There weren't fair and public hearings by competent and independent and impartial courts. And in many cases, there were no lawyers, and some cases were restricted as classified, I should say, as secret. So the process went on throughout the year after the original May arrests and then the charging. And all the charges are related to the kind of subversive terrorists going against the constitution, all these kind of security-related charges, which the government have decided to use on these human rights defenders. And a lot of the cases have been, as recently as March, some of them are still being appealed. Not only, these people shouldn't be in prison anyway, but we have real concerns about their health. We have concerns about, as I said, the complete lack of independent fair trials. And we also have concerns about torture in the case of 3 of them. And we also have concerns about enforced disappearance, because certainly 3 of them were not, their families didn't know where they were immediately after they they were arrested for some time. So that really, in international law, that constitutes forced disappearance. And then there was also some attacks, which on the defenders, and in a couple of cases, which were dismissed as hooligan, brought to trial as not brought to trial, but the attackers were charged with hooliganism instead of the more serious attack on journalists doing their legitimate work.
Thank you, and I want to get to this, or keep on this point for 1 second. Tajikistan, of course, it borders Afghanistan. They have had incidents of terrorism in the past, but these people that have been arrested, you've seen some of the reports about this stuff. Was there any hint that any of these people actually could have been considered legitimately extremists or terrorists?
No, I mean, not from our investigation and not from the detailed research. You will remember I went to Tajikistan late last year, which was November, and it has taken us from November to now to verify, to research all these cases. So we're fairly convinced. I mean, we are convinced that these are legitimate and peaceful human rights defenders. I do think the Tajik government is paranoid about security because of the border with Afghanistan, and I fully understand that. It came up a lot in my discussions with Tajik government officials, and I can understand that. But that in no way allows you to break international law and just put away people that are perceived to be anti-government and to be working for minorities or unpopular issues that challenge the government's power and challenge the complete stranglehold that the government and the president in particular has over the Tajik population.
Okay, thank you. And you were out there. Did you have any access to any of these people or their families? I mean, you mentioned that people are terrified of the government and don't want to talk too much. But you being an official from the UN, were you able to speak with any of the people who have been imprisoned or with their immediate family members?
We spoke. We spoke to defenders who weren't in prison, but we had to speak to them secretly. We also we asked for a meeting with Dalar Momali and Abdullah Gurbati, and we did get to see them in the where they were being detained. The Tajik security wanted to stay in the meeting with us, but I said no, so they left. And it was heartrending to talk to these two young men. Dalar, I understand he had just one other brother who died, and his mother is in a terrible state because she's afraid of what will happen to him, that he might die because he's had health issues in the past. And Abdullah Gurbati, the other guy that we saw, he had just been detained 1 week after his baby was born. And, their health conditions, I mean, to listen to them coughing. And, of course, they're terrified of TB in the prison. And to listen to them and to see the condition of their skin was horrendous. And they were completely and absolutely distraught. So, yeah, that was awful. We did try to I asked for a meeting with Ulfa Tonam Mamad Shoeva and also Manucheker Kolik Nazarov, but that was denied.
And I know we're running short on time, but I'm curious about what your reaction is with the Tajik government. I mean, in the past, there have been UN working groups on arbitrary detention who sent recommendations to the Tajik government, which they're actually supposed to respond to, but they haven't done it. Now, you've raised some of these concerns with Tajik officials. Have you seen them taking any actions based on your recommendations?
Well, it's a bit early days yet because they get 60 days to respond to this communication. The one positive thing I suppose I saw was having seen those two men in such poor health, I did ask the general in charge of the prisons to to send in the doctor to examine the people in that place. And I got confirmation that a doctor had, in fact, been allowed, not been allowed, but a doctor was sent in. But, the problem is everything, there's no transparency. Everything is secret. People talk out of both sides of their mouth. By that I mean, they say the right things, but obviously we know it's a completely different picture. I would be hoping, because I will be presenting a report on Tajikistan to the UN Human Rights Council next March, with the findings of the visit. And that will be a public report. And it will be, as I said, when I present my report, it will be one of the reports that I present, and there will be dialogue with the Tajik ambassador. I would still hope that maybe some of these people might be, their conditions might improve, or there'll be some progress in their cases before March. If the Tajik, and it's a huge if the Tajik government are committed, as they say, to working with the UN, to protecting human rights, and to acting in an honourable and fair way.
Okay, thank you. Are you still in contact with anyone in Tajikistan? Do you get updates on the situation from people?
Well, of course, we had to get updates on the situation for all these cases, but I am limited, as I said, to just the protection of human rights defenders. So, and it is extremely difficult to get information, as you know yourself, from Tajikistan. But we try to maintain contact, and certainly at the time of the writing of this communication in April, we had been in touch regularly, on and off, between the visit end, which was December, and the end of March, before we drafted this communication, which is really very substantive.
Okay, and then last question, and I'll also give you a chance to make any comments you want that we might have missed something, because I know you're pressed for time again. But my question is, I saw this press release, and I don't remember so many officials from the UN being involved in releasing something like this. Is this such a special case? I mean, you have a whole list of people who are the special rapporteur for different sections of society. Is this unique?
Well, I'll tell you, I deliberately asked some of the other rapporteurs to join me on this communication and press release. And what that means is they all get a chance to input. Some of them, obviously, we all have our own area, but in some cases, of course, it intersects with other people, like, for example, the rapporteur on lawyers and judges. So there's a number of lawyers who are human rights defenders in this communication, and also there are people like the special rapporteur on countering terrorism, because we see all these charges, these fake charges that they put against them, are all in the name of security and branding them the next best thing to a terrorist. And torture, the special rapporteur on torture, because we know there's been a couple of cases there where defenders have been tortured. So I was hoping that by doing this, it would strengthen our appeal to the Tajik government. Normally you would not get as many rapporteurs, because it does slow down the process, because everybody has to input, and sometimes that's not time-wise, that's not a great thing. But because this was such an important communication, and it was so important to get the full, I suppose, weight of those rapporteurs who have a mandate which intersects with mine in relation to the treatment of these human rights defenders, I asked them. So that's how it occurred.
Okay, thank you. And then, again, you have 3 minutes. Any anything you want to say to the audience, recommendations or organizations you want to cite as being helpful, particularly non-UN organizations that have helped out with this research or in the campaign to try to get these people out of prison?
Well, I'm afraid I couldn't be talking publicly about the sources, because that might also endanger them. All of our sources were mainly people within Tajikistan. But what we are looking for, we want information, the factual and legal basis for the arrest, detention, charging and sentencing of these human rights defenders. And also, why were the cases, some of them classified as secret? And why were some of the trials closed to the public, where it wasn't, where it was applicable, because they weren't all supposed to be? And then how do these arrests and charging, how do they comply with international law? And then we want to know about, has there been any investigation into the enforced disappearance of three of them, Mr. Sabiov, Mr. Kotibov and Mr. Jumaev? And then when it comes to alleged torture and ill treatment, has there been any investigation into that, of the ill treatment and torture apparently suffered or allegedly suffered by Dalar Babiyev, Abdusatar Korobov and Ulfatonim Mamad Shoeva? And then there was a physical attack against Mr. Avadmad Gorbatov as well. So we need, there are standards. There's a manual on effective investigation and documentation of torture and other cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment of punishment. And the Tajik government is supposed to follow that. And then we're very concerned about the health of pretty much all of them, because the conditions are terrible, their health is declining, and there isn't adequate medical attention. And even food. Relatives have to bring in food, and sometimes they don't have food. But I was told by one of the defenders I visited, whoever gets food, they share with everybody else in the cell. So these are all the kind of questions that we have asked the Tajik government. We are awaiting their response. And also, really, human rights defenders should be able to operate legitimately in Tajikistan for peacefully expressing their opinion and working on the rights of other people. And freedom of expression should never be criminalized when it comes to human rights defense.
Okay, well, great. Thank you very much. That was Mary Lawlor, UN rapporteur on human rights defenders. I appreciate you taking time to be with us today, and I wish you a good weekend. And joining me for the second half of the show to discuss this is Nazila Ghanea, UN Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Religion and Belief, and one of the experts who took part in preparing the UN press release. Ms. Ghanea visited Tajikistan in April to visit the situation for herself, and thank you very much for joining me. First, can you describe for our audience what's been happening in Tajikistan recently that especially caught your attention that prompted this press release?
Thank you very much, Bruce. It's a pleasure to be on your program. And thank you for your listeners for their interest. To be very frank, this had been an outstanding request by the previous, my predecessor, the previous special rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief, and the visit hadn't been able to take place because of the COVID situation. And some 20 years ago, the special rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief at the time, the late Asma Jahangir, had visited Tajikistan. So if I give a longer term perspective, the mandate has long shown an interest in Tajikistan and the situation of freedom of religion or belief. But indeed, there have been incidents and events that made that more acute. And we were very pleased that this meeting was facilitated and we were able to go there in April and meet with civil society and government authority alike.
Thank you very much. And could you give us a little more information on your visit in April? Some of the people you met with and what you were looking at, especially when you were out there in Tajikistan. Obviously, religious matters and matters of belief. But could you give us a little more specifics on that?
Certainly. So the mandate is on freedom of religion or belief. That's the right of everyone to hold a religion or belief of their choice, which of course includes change of religion or non-religion, and to be able to manifest it not only alone, but along with others as well, and not only in private, but also in public. Teaching, observance, practice, and education are just some ways that we might see manifestation of freedom of religion or belief, but human rights law leaves that quite open as to how people wish to manifest, including in public and with others. So Tajikistan is curious because when we visit some countries, and this mandate has existed for some 37 years, when we visit some countries, we're particularly concerned about religious or belief minorities or non-believers. In Tajikistan, of course, I was interested in that, and you'll see from the preliminary end of mission statement. So there'll be a fuller report to the Human Rights Council in March next year. But even in that preliminary end of mission statement, we, of course, are concerned about religious or belief minorities in Tajikistan. But with Tajikistan, it's curious that the space, even for the majority, the Muslim Hanafis, is very highly regulated. And this has serious implications on their ability to manifest religion or belief. Just some headings there are women are not welcome to be able to worship in mosques. Children cannot go to mosques. Religious education is highly regulated. And then, of course, for religious or belief minorities, it's regulated, or it has a disproportionate impact. Even if we're talking about the same restrictions on religion or belief, it has a disproportionate impact on minorities because, for example, there needs to be a registration of religious or belief minorities. Their 68 communities are registered, but they need to give annual reports. Their financial transactions needs to be reviewed. There have been communities that have been registered and then deregistered, the Jehovah's Witnesses being a prime example. Their literature needs approval. Religious education is also restricted for them. And of course, the Ismailis also needs some attention in and of itself because of being such a large minority and the interrelationship of minority status and ethnic status. So, and belief status rather. So religion, belief, and minority status.
Thank you. And can we talk just a little bit more about the Pamiri community? Because several of their activists and journalists were named in this UN press release too. Could you speak a little bit about their case? Explain to our audience what's happened with them. I mean, your visit was certainly well timed for their purposes, I imagine.
Yes, there were certainly events happening around us. Of course, we reached out to met with all the authorities that we had requested to meet, barring national security, and we were able to meet with civil society, sometimes online and also in person when we were in Tajikistan. We were able to visit Gabao, and that was between the 15th and 18th of April. As far as I understand, it's the first time a UN Special Rapporteur has been granted that extra permission. You know, you are permitted to go to the country, but an extra permit is required to go to Gabao. And we're the first special rapporteur, the first mandate that was able to visit. Unfortunately, though, visits with the provincial authorities was not facilitated, or it was delayed to such an extent that we had to return because we had other meetings back in Doshambe and needed to have the end of mission press release and press statement before Eid hit on Friday, and that was a day earlier than had previously been envisaged. So unfortunately, we didn't meet with the authorities there, but we had enough meetings and had enough information about the situation that we were able to observe firsthand many of the restrictions and pressures they're under. We heard immediately afterwards that a large number of NGOs had been invited to a security meeting on that same day that we had been there, and had been invited to self-liquidate, which of course is deeply concerning. Now, my mandate is narrower than my good colleague Mary's mandate. It's about freedom of religion or belief. But of course, one way in which religious communities contribute to society, serve society, worship is through service. And that might be through, working with persons with disability, children, education, empowering women, et cetera, et cetera. So these NGOs also sometimes have not only a function as, civil society actors, but also reflect a manifestation of religion or belief, and are, another way in which a community such as the Ismailis are wishing to manifest and practice. So to that extent, it is also deeply concerning to my mandate that occurred.
Okay, thank you. And could you tell us, there's a lot of information recently that facilities and organizations that were founded or certainly supported by the Agahan Development Network have been running into some problems out there. Now, for the benefit of our audience, the Agahan is the leader of the Ismaili community that lives in the Gorno-Badakhshan Autonomous Oblast, Gabao. And of course, he's been very generous financially with trying to fund projects out there. How is the situation with their organizations? Because we're hearing that their government seized some of them. And you mentioned that they had liquidated all these different NGOs. And I imagine among those are probably also some that are funded by the Agahan.
I have also heard those reports, Bruce, and that's after the mission, but it connects with many of the issues we observed and will be reporting on and already issued the press release on. So religious or belief communities must be able to manifest their religion or belief according to their own beliefs, according to their own practices, their own traditions. Of course, traditions and celebrations and practices have a law, there's a 2009 law on freedom of conscience and religious associations. And there's also another law about the practice of traditions, which applies more broadly, but including to the Ismailis and the Pamiris. So manifestation in public, gathering together, practicing together, carrying out religious education activities, meeting for worship, these are all highly restricted more broadly and regulated more broadly in Tajikistan. But we also observed that the Jamaat Khaneh, we were not able to go inside. I understand that there are 2 Jamaat Khanehs that are open throughout the country. And just the sheer size of Tajikistan means that it is impossible for Ismailis to be able to gather together even for the Friday prayer. Now, again, this also reflects more broadly that because of the regulation around the number of people that have access to a 5 prayer a day mosque and a grand mosque, the spread of these mosques for everybody, but particularly for Ismailis that are at least 3% of the population. It's impossible if there's 2 Jamaat Khaneh throughout a country as vast as Tajikistan for people to have access. And if that is important to the community, to religious minorities, not only have the right to freedom of religion or belief, but also they have linguistic rights and cultural rights, and they should have the ability to educate their children. First of all, according to Article 18 in the moral and religious education, parents have the right to be able to bring up their children according to their religion or belief. And secondly, as minorities should be able to maintain their characteristics. So these restrictions bear very heavily on the continuity of the characteristics of minorities, and also the ability to be able to manifest freedom of religion or belief.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to talk about the words terrorism and extremism, because, of course, religious communities are especially vulnerable to these kind of charges, right? In theory, you could hit anybody up with this, but of course, if you're a worshiper, an adherent of a religion, then it's much easier to put this on you, brand you as an extremist or terrorist, even if it has nothing to do. Can you talk about how the Tajik authorities have used these laws against people inside the country?
Certainly, Bruce. We know there's the 2020 law on countering extremism and the 2021 law on combating terrorism. The definitions really matter. First of all, there's immediately a concern that there's no mention of violent extremism. It's not qualified by violent extremism, but extremism itself. And then we need to be concerned about the evidentiary requirements for both that and terrorism and incitement, which itself carries criminal sanctions and fines. It's a very slippery slope. If the lawyers are fear for their own professional security, let alone their personal security, then there can't be due process for those that have been accused of extremism or terrorism. If I give a vivid example, in some of the meetings, I would ask about extremism, and the response would be about terrorism, which sets off even more alarm bells because, the question is about violent extremism or extremism according to the law of Tajikistan, but the response is about terrorism. So we've muddled one, we've folded one into the other, which carries even higher punishments. We were also able to visit a prison while we were there. It was one of the newer prisons outside Dushanbe. And, there's a new law on equality and discrimination. And in it, there is a protection for reasonable accommodation. And I asked if there can be an example given of how a prisoner had been reasonably accommodated. So the consideration might be given to their religion or belief. And, for example, the requirements to shave the beard on entry and every week, the ability to be able to pray, etc. But there were no examples that were shared. So I'm not sure if that law is actually being practiced or implemented.
Thank you. I'm also curious, too, that obviously, your office has been following events in Tajikistan very closely for a long time. And you've been following it certainly for some time, and as long as you've been in your position right now. The fact that the UN decided to issue this press release at all, and that they had enlisted the help of so many different special rapporteurs in this report, seemed to indicate that something is more alarming now than was usually the case. Is there anything from your side that you saw that's been more alarming recently, post May 2022, that triggers, some kind of alarm bells or something? The situation has noticeably deteriorated very recently.
Some of them, I find it hard to compare gravity of concern. Some of the issues have been ongoing. So the concern that minorities and legitimate religious manifestation can be restricted because of the allegation of extremism and terrorism so easily, or that incitement, the law against incitements, was not informed by developments in the United Nations over 20 years. We not only have Articles 19 and 20 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, but we have instruments such as the Rabat Plan of Action, the 1618 resolution of the UN Human Rights Council. So it needs to be informed also by interpretations and understandings that have come forward from the UN Human Rights Committee, for example, in General Comment 34. So there are these issues that arise under this triangular regulation: incitement, extremism, terrorism. There are many implications to manifestation of religion or belief, especially in public and with others, that arise from that. And yes, they have been more grave in recent years, in the recent year and a half, especially against Ismailis and Pamiris. There seems to be a restriction of civic space that then has very serious repercussions on religious and belief minorities, and religion or belief even for majorities. So, yes, and that press release came out expressing concern by a whole host of mandate holders. Indeed, when freedom of religion or belief is restricted and so highly regulated that essentially what we remain with is a private religion or belief in the privacy of our home and alone. And that doesn't require a freedom. It's not really a freedom. So when there's discrimination or targeting because of religion or belief, where there is suspicion and surveillance of religion or belief, then we are not only talking about Article 18 on freedom of religion or belief being restricted, but also freedom of association, freedom of assembly, the right to due process, non-discrimination, equality before the law. And I could go on.
Okay, thank you. And I promised that I would not keep you any longer than 20 minutes, and we're actually coming up on that right now. So I'm just going to ask if there's anything you think our audience needs to know about the situation of freedom of religion in Tajikistan that you want to convey to them.
In the report, and I echo it again, I said that, clearly the ambition to be able to create an environment of tolerance on grounds of religion or belief is a noble one, is a positive one. But the price to be paid for maintaining an environment of tolerance should not be the strangulation of freedom of religion or belief, the full scope of the enjoyment of freedom of religion or belief. And I encourage the authorities in the end of mission statements to even if it is gradually, to open up the space and to trust that the opening up of the space for the full enjoyment of freedom of religion or belief, including manifestation, including with others, including for minorities, that this is good for society. It promotes tolerance and diversity rather than the fear that seems to exist that freedom of religion or belief is somehow dangerous and bad for the country. I hope that, Tajikistan has a fantastic history and diversity. I enjoyed speaking Persian and Tajik, and really the people were warm and hospitable. And I wish there was more trust in the society that the freedoms to be enjoyed are not dangerous for the society. I hope that I see that more and more. And of course, as I expressed in every single meeting, I stand ready to support any efforts by government authorities or others to gradually open this space and to ensure enjoyment. Not only back to how the situation was some 2 or 3 years ago, but an open space for enjoyment, even improved. Already when Asma Jahangir went to Tajikistan, and her report is available, you find that the recommendations were appealing for a space for the greater enjoyment of freedom of religion or belief. We're not in that environment anymore. It's much more restrictive. So we need to, regain the space since then and also then improve on it.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. Thank you very much to Nazila Ghanea and Mary Lawlor for being on the program. And big thank you, as always, to Nathan Shoemaker, our Majlis podcast producer in Washington, D.C. And a reminder, you can subscribe to the Majlis podcast or the Central Asia in Focus newsletter by visiting Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's website at rfarl.org. Thank you very much, and we will be back next week.